The first snow of the season came down thick and silent over the Val Verde, and Warren Cooper almost missed the broken latch on his family's barn because his collar was turned up against the wind, and his mind was on the cattle he had spent the last 2 hours pushing down out of the high pasture before the drifts closed the trail. He noticed it only because his gelding balked at the door, ears pinned, nostrils flaring at something inside that was not right. Warren swung down, rifle already coming free of the scabbard, and eased the barn door open with his boot. The lantern light inside was low and guttering, and for one heartbeat all he saw was a shape crouched over the feed bin, a shawl thrown back off dark hair, hands buried in the burlap sack of oats like she meant to steal the whole winter's ration. He had chased off 2 cattle thieves in his life and shot at neither of them, but 3 years of watching his family's herd whittled down by hard men had taught him not to hesitate with his voice, if not his trigger finger. "Hold it right there," he said, leveling the rifle. "Whatever you are taking, you are going to put it back and explain yourself before I decide what to do with you." The woman did not scream or run. She turned around slow, oats still cupped in both hands, and looked at him with an expression that held far more anger than fear. "I am taking oats for a horse that has been standing in the cold for 2 hours pulling a wagon uphill through snow it should never have been driving through," she said. "And if you shoot me, mister, you had better be prepared to explain to whoever comes looking for me why there is a dead schoolteacher in your barn and an injured man freezing in a wagon a quarter-mile from your door." Warren did not lower the rifle right away, though something in her voice, steady even with her breath fogging in the cold, made him want to. "An injured man. My driver, Mr. Whitfield. The wagon went over on the grade when the road iced beneath us, and his leg is broken, and I did not have time to stand on ceremony asking permission before I found shelter and feed for a horse that has done nothing but suffer for our carelessness." She set the oats down with exaggerated care, as if to prove she was no threat, though her chin stayed lifted. "I was going to leave a note. I intended to pay for everything I have used. I am not a thief, whatever you have decided about me in the last 10 seconds. He studied her. She was younger than he had first guessed in the lantern light, maybe 24 or 25, with a wool coat too thin for the mountains and boots that had clearly never met New Mexico territory mud before this week. Snow clung to her shoulders and had melted into dark spots on her collar. Behind the anger in her face there was real exhaustion, the kind that came from more than one bad hour. Warren lowered the rifle. "Where is this wagon?" he said. She led him out into the snow, along a track of footprints already filling in, to where a light farm wagon sat tipped against a fence post at an angle that told him the axle was likely cracked. A man of perhaps 60 lay wrapped in every blanket the wagon had carried, his face gray with cold and pain, one leg splinted crudely with a wagon spoke and torn cloth. "You set that splint yourself," Warren said, more statement than question, crouching to look. "I have read a book on frontier medicine twice through since Missouri," the woman said. "I did not expect to need it so soon." "You did not do a bad job of it," he looked up at her. "What is your name?" "Annie Holloway." "Warren Cooper. This is Orda's land, my mother's family's rancho. Let us get your Mr. Whitfield inside before that leg gets any colder than it already is." It took both of them and considerable effort to get Silas Whitfield onto the bench Warren fashioned into a makeshift stretcher. And by the time they reached the low adobe house with its lantern-lit windows, Warren's mother, Dolores Ortiz Cooper, was already at the door, drawn by the sound of the wagon dogs barking. She took one look at the injured man and began issuing orders in Spanish and English both. And within the hour Silas Whitfield lay in the guest room with willow bark tea inside him and Dolores' own careful hands resetting the splint properly, muttering about foolish Easterners who thought New Mexico territory in November was the same as Missouri in October. Annie Holloway sat at the kitchen table wrapped in one of Dolores' shawls, hands cupped around a cup of coffee she had not yet tasted, watching the door to the guest room with an intensity that told Warren this Mr. Whitfield mattered to her a great deal more than an employer to a hired driver usually did. "He was my father's oldest friend," she said, when she caught Warren looking. "He agreed to drive me out here because no one else would, and because he did not think a woman ought to travel 200 miles alone even in this modern age. I told him the snow would hold off another week. I was wrong, and now he is broken because I did not listen to the men at the last town who told us to wait. The first snow catches everybody who has not lived through one out here," Warren said. "It caught men who have ridden this country 20 years. You should not carry that alone." She looked at him properly then, and something in her face eased just slightly, the anger of the barn replaced by a wary kind of gratitude. "Thank you for not shooting me, Mr. Cooper." "Warren," he said. "And you are welcome. Though I will say, for a woman caught stealing oats at gunpoint, you argued your case better than most men I have met." The corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I intend to argue a good many cases in this territory, Mr. Cooper. You may as well get used to it." He did not know yet how true that would prove, nor how much of his own life it would come to unsettle, but lying awake later that night listening to the wind and the settling snow, Warren Cooper found he was in no hurry to forget the sound of her voice insisting she was no thief. Silas Whitfield's leg kept them at the rancho for 4 days while the snow settled and the roads became passable again. And in that time, Warren watched Annie Holloway with the sharp, careful attention of a man used to reading horses and weather, because she did not fit easily into any shape he already knew for a woman. She helped his mother card wool in the mornings and asked dolers question after question about the valley, about which families had children, about who could read and who could not, about the schoolhouse that did not exist and had never existed in Rincon, the small town 2 hours' ride from the rancho that served as the valley's meeting place, its trading post, and its only claim to being a town at all. "I have a letter from a teacher's academy in St. Louis and $40 of my own money and a trunk of primers," Annie told dolers on the 3rd morning, while Warren pretended to be occupied mending a bridle by the fire and was in fact listening to every word. "I intend to open a school in Rincon before the year turns, if the town will let me, and if they will not let me easily, I intend to open it anyway. There has never been schooling here beyond what the priest teaches on Sundays," dolers said. "Some families will not want their children taught in English only. Some in town will not want Mexican children taught at all, not sitting beside their own. Then I will teach in both languages, and anyone who does not like children sitting beside each other can keep their children home," Annie said, and there was no doubt in her voice at all. Warren's needle stopped moving through the leather. He had heard plenty of people declare intentions in this valley before, mostly men, mostly about cattle prices or water rights, and mostly hedged about with enough qualifications to leave themselves an escape if things went hard. He had never heard anyone declare something so plainly and so completely without one. On the 4th day, with Whitfield resting easier and grumbling that he would be dancing again by Christmas, Annie announced she needed to go into Rincon to see about lumber and supplies, since her school could not build itself out of good intentions. Warren offered to drive her in the ranch's spare wagon, telling himself it was only sensible, since her own wagon needed a wheelwright, and she did not know the road, and the temperature had dropped hard enough overnight that a woman alone risked frostbite if anything else went wrong. Annie accepted the offer with a raised eyebrow that suggested she saw through his excuses perfectly well, and had decided to let him have them anyway. Rincon was not much more than a wide dirt street lined with a church, a cantina, a livery, a small adobe building that served as the sheriff's office, and Horace Dunmeyer's general store, which carried everything from flour to firearms to bolts of calico, and which Dunmeyer ran with the confident air of a man who knew he had no competition for 50 miles and priced his goods accordingly. Warren followed Annie inside mostly out of curiosity, And it was there, standing near a barrel of nails pretending to examine a hoof pick he did not need, that he watched something happen that he would remember for the rest of his life, though at the time he only knew it was remarkable. $2 a pane for window glass, Dunmere said, sliding a ledger across the counter as though the number were carved in stone by the hand of God himself. That is my price, ma'am, and it is fair, considering what it costs me to freight glass out here without it breaking. Mr. Dunmere, I priced window glass in Santa Fe before I left, and I priced it again from the catalog, Mr. Whitfield carries for his own trade, and both of those prices come to $1.10 a pane, freight included, for glass that has already traveled considerably farther than yours has from Trinidad, Annie said, not raising her voice at all, simply laying a folded catalog page on the counter beside his ledger. I am prepared to pay $1.25, which allows you a fair profit for the trouble of storing it, and I am prepared to order 12 panes today, in cash, which I imagine is more business than you have done with any one customer this month. Dunmire's mustache twitched. That catalog price does not account for the difficulty of the mountain roads. It accounts for freight from Trinidad to Santa Fe, which is a longer and harder road than Santa Fe to Rincon, and we both know it, Annie said pleasantly. I am not asking you to lose money, Mr. Dunmire. I am asking you to charge me the same price you would charge a man who had taken the trouble to learn your prices before walking in the door. I have taken that trouble. $1.25, 12 panes, and I will also need 40 feet of stovepipe, 60 pounds of nails, and I understand you have a stove in your back room that has been sitting unsold since summer on account of a dent in its door that does not affect the draw at all. I will take that stove for $6 instead of the $10 you are asking, and in exchange, I will tell every family in this valley that Horace Dunmire's store is the place to bring their children's shoes to be resoled once my school opens, and they need somewhere reliable to send their money. There was a long pause in which Dunmire looked at her the way a man looks at a hand of cards he had been sure was a winner until the last card turned over. $1.20 a pane, he said. And I will not come down on the stove below $8. $1.20 a pane and $7 for the stove, and you throw in the use of your storeroom for 2 weeks while my lumber is being cut, since I have nowhere else dry to keep it, and we have a deal, Mr. Dunmire. Dunmire looked at her a moment longer, then let out a short laugh that had grudging respect buried somewhere inside it. Ma'am, I do not know where you learned to trade, but you would have done well on the Santa Fe Trail in the old days. $7, the storeroom, and I never want to hear that you told anyone I gave a woman a bad price. You have my word, Mr. Dunmire, Annie said, and shook his hand across the counter like a man closing a cattle deal. Warren stood by the nail barrel through the whole exchange, hoof pick forgotten in his hand, and felt something shift and settle inside his chest the way a saddle settles once it is cinched exactly right. He had grown up around men who prided themselves on hard bargaining, vaqueros who could talk a buyer up on a horse's price with nothing but confidence and a straight face, and he had never once seen anyone do it with the calm, unhurried precision this woman had just used on a merchant twice her size and 3 times her local standing. She had not raised her voice. She had not flattered him. She had simply known exactly what she wanted, exactly what it was worth, and exactly how to get it without making an enemy in the process. He watched her count out the money from a small purse with careful, economical movements, watched her thank Dunmire again with genuine warmth now that the business was concluded, and by the time she turned around to find Warren staring, he had already decided, with the quiet certainty of a man who did not change his mind easily once it was made up, that Annie Holloway was the most capable person he had ever met in his 26 years on this earth. "You are staring, Mr. Cooper," she said, amused. "I am admiring," he said. "There is a difference." "Is there?" "There is when the admiring is deserved." He picked up one end of the stovepipe bundle before she could reach for it. "Come on. I will help you get this loaded, And then I expect you had better tell me exactly how large a schoolhouse you are planning, because from the sound of that bargain, you are not planning a small one." Annie's laugh, when it came, was surprised out of her, bright and unguarded in a way that made something in Warren's chest go warm despite the cold wind cutting down the street. "I am planning a schoolhouse for every child in this valley who wants to learn, Mr. Cooper, whatever language their grandmother speaks at home," she said. "It is going to need to be considerably larger than Mr. Dunmire's storeroom." They rode back out of town with the wagon loaded, and neither of them noticed, that first afternoon, the two men on good horses standing outside the sheriff's office watching the wagon pass with more interest than two strangers idling in the cold had any honest reason to show. Word travels fast in a small valley, and word of Annie Holloway's school spread through Rincon and the scattered ranches around it within a week, carried on the backs of gossip and genuine curiosity both. Some families were eager, weary of watching their children grow up unable to read a bill of sale or a letter from kin back east or south. Others were slower to trust, uneasy about an unmarried Anglo woman arriving from nowhere with talk of teaching everybody's children under one roof regardless of what language filled their houses at supper. Warren's uncle, Raphael Ordaz, was among the slower ones, and he said so plainly the first evening Annie came to supper at the rancho to discuss whether the Ordaz children of the valley might attend. "You will teach my grandnephews to speak good English and forget their Spanish inside a year," Raphael said, not unkindly, but with the weight of a man who had watched other valleys lose their language to other schools before this one. "I have seen it happen in Las Vegas. Children come home ashamed of the words their own mothers taught them." "Then I will not teach it that way," Annie said, without hesitation. "I intend to teach reading and arithmetic in both languages, side by side, because a child who can read a contract in English and argue the same contract in Spanish is a child no land agent can cheat quite so easily. I do not want to erase anything, Mr. Ordaz. I want to add to what is already there." Raphael studied her for a long moment across the table, the same long, evaluating look Warren remembered his uncle giving green colts before deciding whether they were worth the trouble of breaking. "You have thought about this," Raphael said finally. "I have thought of little else since I decided to come west," Annie said. "Then you may teach my grandnephews," Raphael said, "and if you teach them to be ashamed of their grandmother's tongue, I will come to that schoolhouse myself and teach the lesson over again the right way." It was, Warren thought, watching his uncle and this stubborn, capable Missouri woman come to terms across his mother's table, about as warm a welcome as Raphael Ordaz had ever given anyone who was not already family. The schoolhouse rose through the last weeks of November on a plot of land the Valley families agreed to donate at the edge of town, close enough to Rincon to be reached by wagon or horse or on foot from most of the outlying ranches, far enough to have room for a garden and a well of its own. Warren found himself there most days that his own work allowed, roping timber up onto the growing walls, showing Annie how to splice a rope that had frayed, teaching her, at her insistence, to sit a horse properly astride instead of perched side saddle like an ornament, since she declared she had no intention of being stranded again the way she had been the night of the first snow. "You have good hands," he told her one gray afternoon, adjusting her grip on the reins while her borrowed mare, a patient old mare named Canela, walked a slow circle around the corral. "You do not fight the horse. Most people who have never ridden fight the horse without knowing they are doing it. I have spent my whole life being told what I am not supposed to be capable of," Annie said, watching her own hands rather than him, a faint flush on her cheeks that might have been only the cold. "I have decided I would rather find out what I am capable of instead." "I noticed that," Warren said. "The day I met you, standing in my barn arguing with a man pointing a rifle at you like it was nothing more than a rude interruption," she laughed, and Canela's ears flicked back at the sound. "You were the rude interruption, Mr. Cooper. I had a very good system going with those oats. You were stealing my oats. I was borrowing your oats with every intention of paying for them, which I did, if you recall, the very next morning." "You did," he admitted. "In full and with interest, which nobody asked you for." "I do not like owing debts I have not settled," Annie said, and something in the set of her jaw when she said it told Warren this was truer and went deeper than horse feed. "Not money, not anything. I would rather know exactly where I stand with a person than wonder." Warren felt the words land somewhere uncomfortable in his chest, because he was, at that moment, a man with a debt of his own he had not settled, a truth he had not told her, and though he did not yet know how badly it would matter, some old instinct warned him that a woman who spoke of honesty with that much conviction would not easily forgive finding out a man had kept something from her. He said nothing of it that afternoon. He told himself there would be time later when things were quieter, when the school was finished and the valley had settled, and there was less at stake in the telling. He did not yet understand how little time the valley actually had. The trouble that would come to swallow all of their quiet afternoons had already been circling for weeks by then, in the shape of a well-dressed man named Elias Granger, who had taken rooms above the cantina in Rincon, and who represented, according to the papers he showed anyone who asked, the Rio Grande Land and Development Company, acting on behalf of investors in Boston and New York who intended to see a spur line of the Continental Southern Railway built through the Val Verde within 2 years, on its way toward richer coal country to the west. Granger was polite, unfailingly so, and he bought drinks for anyone willing to sit and talk, and he spoke often and warmly of progress, of the schools and churches and prosperity a railroad would bring to a valley that had, in his telling, been forgotten by the modern age. What he spoke of less often, though Warren had begun to hear the pieces of it from ranch hands and store clerks, and the occasional loose-lipped man who had taken one too many of Granger's free drinks, was that the survey for the spur line ran directly through the oldest, most fertile bottomland in the valley, through the Ordaz family's grazing land, and through 3 other family holdings besides, land held under grants confirmed generations back. Land that had never once passed through an American land office, because it had never needed to. "They are saying the grants were never properly recorded under territorial law," Raphael told Warren one evening in early December, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man holding back a great deal of anger. "Saying our claim needs new confirmation, new surveys, new paperwork filed and paid for in Santa Fe, and that until it is filed the land is open to purchase by anyone who files first." "That is not the law," Warren said. "The treaty protects grants confirmed before the war." "You know that as well as I do." "I know it. Whether the land office in Santa Fe knows it, or cares to remember it when a company with Boston money is filing papers and greasing the right hands, is another matter." Raphael's jaw was tight. "Granger's man came to your mother yesterday while you were at the schoolhouse, offered her $300 for land worth 10 times that, and told her if she did not take it now, the survey would go through anyway and she would get nothing when it did." Warren felt something cold settle low in his gut, a feeling he recognized though it had been years since he had felt it this strongly, because he had heard those exact words before, in a different valley, 100 miles south, spoken by men he himself had once ridden alongside. He had been 19 years old. 3 years after his father's death had left the family short of hands and shorter of money, when a land agent's recruiter had offered good pay for men who could ride, and were not particular about whose fences they rode past. Warren had told himself, at 19, that he was only helping survey crews move equipment, only riding herd on company horses, only doing honest work for honest wages in a hard year when honest wages were scarce. He had told himself that for the better part of 6 months, riding for a company called the Rio Seco Land Syndicate, until the night he watched 2 of his fellow riders set torches to the fence line, and the barn of a widow named Estrada who had refused to sign papers she could not read, and he had understood, all at once and too late, exactly what kind of work he had actually been doing. He had ridden away from that outfit the next morning and had never spoken of it again, not to his mother, not to Raphael, not to anyone in the valley who had known him only as Dolores Cooper's son, the vaquero, the good hand with horses. He had told himself the shame of those 6 months was his alone to carry, a debt owed to no one but his own conscience, since he had left before real blood was spilled and had never taken payment for that final month's ugly work. He had not told Annie Holloway either. In all the weeks of building the schoolhouse and teaching her to sit a horse and watching her bargain merchants down to fair prices with nothing but arithmetic and nerve. He had not told her, and now, with the same kind of company circling his own family's land with the same kind of offers, he understood exactly how much that silence was going to cost him if it ever came to light. It came to light 3 days before the schoolhouse was finished, on an evening when half the valley had gathered at the cantina to discuss what could be done about the survey, about Granger, about the letters some families had already received from the land office demanding proof of title within 30 days or forfeiture. Warren had come to speak, had planned to speak about how the company's tactics worked, about the pattern he recognized when a man he did not know, a drifter who had ridden in with Granger's crew, stood up near the back of the room and pointed a finger at him. "I know this one," the drifter said, loud enough to carry over the murmur of the room. "Rode for the Rio Seco Syndicate, same as me, back in '78. Burned Estrada's barn with the rest of us, or stood by and watched it burn, which comes to the same thing in my book. Funny thing for a man to stand up here now and warn everybody about company men, when he used to be one himself." The room went silent in the particular way a room goes silent when something true and terrible has just been said aloud. Warren felt every eye in the cantina swing toward him, felt his mother's sharp intake of breath from where she sat near the front, felt, worst of all, Annie Holloway's gaze find his face and stay there, waiting. "Is it true?" she asked, quiet enough that only those nearest heard it, though the question seemed to fill the whole room anyway. Warren could have lied. He understood, in that frozen moment, that a lie might have saved the evening, might have let him deny it and call the drifter a liar, and let the doubt fall on a stranger instead of himself. He found he could not do it, not to her, not after everything she had said about debts and honesty and knowing where she stood. "It is true," he said. "I rode for that outfit for 6 months when I was 19, because my family needed the money and I told myself it was only honest work. I left the night I saw what honest work actually meant to that company. I have carried the shame of those 6 months every day since, and I did not tell any of you because I was ashamed, and because I hoped it would never matter again." He looked around the room, at faces he had known his whole life now looking back at him with something new and unwelcome in them. "I am sorry. I should have told you all myself, long before some stranger did it for me." "You should have told her," Raphael said quietly, nodding toward Annie, and it was not an accusation exactly, but it cut deeper than one would have. Annie did not say anything more that night. She rose from her seat, gathered her shawl around her shoulders, and walked out of the cantina into the cold, and Warren, watching her go, understood with a sick certainty that he had lost something in that room that would take a great deal more than an apology to win back. The days that followed were the worst Warren could remember since his father's death. The valley's trust in him, built slowly over years of honest work and steady hands, seemed to evaporate overnight, replaced by whispered suspicion. If he had once ridden for a company that burned out widows, people reasoned, could he truly be trusted now, warning them against a different company doing the same thing? Was he perhaps still in Granger's pocket, playing some longer game? The suspicion was unfair and largely without evidence, but suspicion rarely required evidence to spread once it had been planted, and Granger, sensing an opportunity, did nothing to discourage the whispers and a great deal to quietly encourage them. Annie kept working on the schoolhouse in those days, kept teaching the first lessons to the handful of children whose families had not wavered. But she did not seek Warren out, and when their paths crossed at the building site or in town, her politeness was careful and distant in a way that hurt him more than open anger would have. "I am not asking you to forgive it," Warren told her, catching her alone one afternoon by the schoolhouse well, unable to bear the distance any longer. "I know 6 months of shame does not undo itself with one apology. I am only asking you to believe that I am not the man I was at 19, and that I did not lie to you. I only failed to tell you something I should have told you the day we met. There is a difference between a lie and a silence, Warren, but there is not always as much difference as you might hope," Annie said, and her voice was not cruel, only tired and honest in the way he had come to expect from her and love, and it wounded worse for being so fair. "I told you once that I would rather know exactly where I stand with a person than wonder. I meant that. I still mean it. I do not think you are the man Granger's company made of you at 19. But I do not yet know for certain who you are instead, because you kept the hardest part of your own story locked away from me, and I have to learn to trust the rest of what you tell me all over again, knowing that." She looked at him, and there was real regret in her face alongside the resolve. "I am not walking away from you, Warren Cooper, but I need you to understand that trust, once it is shaken, has to be rebuilt with more than words. It has to be rebuilt with what you do next." It was not the ending he feared, but it was not the forgiveness he had hoped for either, and Warren rode home that evening with her words settled heavy in his chest, understanding for the first time in his life exactly how much a silence, however well-intentioned, could cost. What Warren did next came sooner and more violently than either of them expected. He had taken, in the days since the drifter's accusation, to riding a wide patrol around the schoolhouse and the outlying ranches late at night, unable to shake the old instinct that told him Granger's men, having failed to buy the land cheaply, and having succeeded in souring the valley's trust in its most vocal critic, would not simply give up. He told himself it was foolishness, that he was only trying to prove something to himself, to the valley, perhaps to Annie, and he continued the patrols anyway. It was on the 9th night of December, with the second snowfall of the season dusting the ground and a wind that cut through wool like it was nothing, that Warren smelled smoke before he saw the glow, and spurred his horse hard toward the schoolhouse with a fear colder than the wind driving through him. The building was burning at one corner when he arrived, flames already climbing the fresh-cut timber of the wall nearest the road, and in the flickering orange light he saw a figure running toward the door rather than away from it, skirts caught up in one hand. "Annie!" he shouted, throwing himself off the horse before it had fully stopped. "The land papers!" she shouted back, not slowing. "The affidavits, the grant copies, Judge Ames's letters, they are all inside. I locked them in the desk. I have to get them before—" Warren caught her arm before she reached the doorway, the heat already rolling off the burning wall in waves. "You are not going in there alone. Then come with me, but do not stand there arguing while it burns." They went in together, low, coats pulled over their mouths against the smoke, and found the desk against the far wall not yet touched by flame, though smoke had already filled the room enough to sting their eyes to streaming. Warren wrenched the desk drawer open with the strength of pure fear, and Annie swept the bundle of papers into her arms, and they were turning to run when a support beam near the door groaned and dropped a shower of burning splinters across the threshold. "This way," Warren said, dragging her toward the window instead, kicking out the half-finished shutter with one boot, and they half fell, half climbed through the gap into the cold night air, Annie clutching the papers to her chest, both of them coughing, both of them alive, as behind them the schoolhouse's near wall collapsed inward with a roar of sparks against the snow. They lay in the trampled snow for a long moment, catching their breath, and when Annie finally looked at Warren, her face streaked with soot and her eyes bright with tears that were not entirely from smoke, something in the careful distance she had held for the past week simply broke apart. "You could have been killed," she said, half accusation, half something far softer. "So could you," he said, and you went in anyway for a stack of paper. That paper is the only proof we have that Granger's company is lying about the grants. It is the only proof that might save your family's land, and 3 other families' land besides. It is not just paper, Warren. It is." Her voice caught, and whatever she had meant to say next dissolved as Warren reached out and brushed a smear of ash from her cheek, his hand lingering there, and the space between them closed without either of them quite deciding to close it. The kiss, when it came, tasted of smoke and cold air and something neither of them had let themselves say aloud yet, and it lasted only a few seconds before the reality of the burning schoolhouse and the danger they had barely escaped came crashing back in around them. But in those few seconds, Warren felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled since the night in the cantina, a certainty that whatever else had to be rebuilt between them. This much, at least, was true and was not going anywhere. Annie pulled back first, breathing hard, her hand still fisted in his coat. "I do not know what to do with that," she admitted, low and honest in the firelight. "I do not know if this is the danger talking or something real, and I told you, I need to know where I stand before I can trust it. I cannot love a man in the middle of a fire and then wonder about him again once the smoke clears." "Then let me show you," Warren said. "Not with words. You do not have to trust my words yet. Let me show you with what I do next, the way you said. Starting tonight. Starting with getting these papers somewhere safe and getting Granger's fraud in front of a judge before he can burn anything else." Annie looked at him a long moment, firelight dancing in her eyes, and finally nodded, and though nothing was fully settled between them, something had shifted. Some door left open a crack that had been closed a week before. They rode together that same night to the small house at the edge of the valley, where retired Circuit Judge Percival Ames lived with his widowed daughter, and though it was well past midnight when they arrived, Ames received them without complaint once he understood what they carried. He was a spare, sharp-eyed man in his 70s who had once ridden Circuit through half the territory before his knees gave out, and he read through the singed bundle of affidavits and grant copies with the slow, careful attention of a man who had spent a lifetime learning not to miss the detail that mattered. "Well," he said finally, setting the papers down on his kitchen table, "this is more than fraud, Miss Holloway. This is forgery, if these signatures on the land office letters are what they appear to be. Someone has signed old Tomás Estrada's name to a quitclaim on land that man's family sold 30 years before this document claims he signed it, because Tomás Estrada has been dead since 1861, and a dead man cannot sign anything, no matter what Mr. Granger's company would like the Territorial Land Office to believe." "Estrada," Warren said, the old wound in his chest opening at the name. "That is the same family whose barn I helped burn 13 years ago, riding for the Rio Seco Syndicate." Ames looked at him with something that was not quite sympathy, but was not condemnation either. "Then perhaps, son, this is the way you finish paying that debt. A signed and sworn statement from you, describing what you witnessed and what tactics that syndicate used, laid alongside these forged documents, would carry real weight in front of a land office judge, precisely because you were once inside the company's methods and know them from the belly out. It would cost you. People would say ugly things about a man testifying against his own past, but it might be the thing that saves this valley's land." Warren thought of the drifter standing in the cantina, of the whispers that had followed him since, of Annie's careful, wounded distance, and understood that Ames was offering him a chance to turn the very shame that had cost him the valley's trust into the instrument of its rescue. "I will sign it," Warren said, "whatever it costs." Annie, sitting beside him at the old judge's table, reached over and set her hand briefly over his, and though she said nothing, the gesture said enough. Judge Ames drew up the affidavits over the following 2 days, gathering statements not only from Warren but from Raphael, from 3 other families whose land the survey threatened, from Silas Whitfield, whose leg had healed enough to hobble about on a crutch and who, it turned out, had once clerked for a land office in Missouri and understood exactly what forged conveyance documents looked like when he saw one. Together they assembled a case sturdy enough, Ames judged, to bring before the district court in Alameda, the county seat a day and a half's ride to the south, where a federal land commissioner was scheduled to hear Grant disputes the following week. Granger did not wait quietly for that hearing. 3 days after the fire, as Warren rode alone from the rancho toward town to deliver a message to Ames, he was stopped on the road by Sheriff Cole Ferris and 2 deputized men, all 3 with rifles across their saddles. "Warren Cooper, I have a warrant for your arrest," Ferris said, not meeting Warren's eyes directly, "on the charge of assault against a surveyor employed by the Rio Grande Land and Development Company, occurring the night before last." "I was at Judge Ames's house the night before last, with 3 other witnesses who can say the same," Warren said, keeping his voice level though anger was rising fast in his chest. "This charge is invented, Ferris, and you know it. I have a sworn complaint and a warrant signed by the county judge in Alameda," Ferris said. "You can argue your alibi in front of him. My job is to see you get there." They took his rifle and his sidearm, bound his wrists, and put him in the back of a covered wagon with barred slats, the kind used for transporting prisoners on the longer routes where no proper jail existed along the way, and set out south toward Alameda at a pace clearly meant to get him beyond the reach of anyone in the Val Verde who might object before the sun set. Word reached the rancho within the hour, carried by a boy who had seen the wagon pass and recognized Warren's face at the barred window. By the time Annie heard it, standing in the half-rebuilt frame of the schoolhouse with hammer still in hand, she understood immediately what Granger intended: to have Warren tried and likely convicted in a county seat where the sheriff, the arresting testimony, and quite possibly the presiding judge himself might all be friendly to company interests, removing the valley's most damaging witness before the land office hearing could ever hear his sworn statement. "They mean to bury him in a jail cell before he can testify," she said to Raphael, who had ridden to the schoolhouse the moment he heard. "We have to reach that wagon before it crosses into the county line, because once it does, Ferris will hand him over to whoever Granger has waiting on the other side, and Judge Ames's writ will carry no weight there at all." "The county line is 2 hours' ride if we push hard," Raphael said. "The wagon has an hour's head start and a heavier load. We can catch it if we do not waste time arguing about whether we should." "Then we ride," Annie said, already moving toward Canela's saddle. "But we do not ride with guns raised first, Raphael. If this goes wrong with shooting, Warren goes to trial not only for a false assault charge, but for whatever violence happens on that road today, and so do the rest of us. We ride with the writ Judge Ames is drafting this very hour, and we ride with enough witnesses that Ferris cannot simply shoot us and claim self-defense to a county judge who has never met any of us." Judge Ames, when they reached his house at a dead gallop, was already at his desk, pen moving fast across a fresh sheet of paper, his daughter holding the sealing wax ready at his elbow. "A writ of habeas corpus," he said without looking up, "on the grounds that the arresting warrant was executed outside the arresting officer's jurisdiction of residence for the accused, that no formal complaint from the alleged victim exists on record, and that the accused has 3 sworn alibi witnesses placing him elsewhere at the hour of the alleged offense. It will not settle the matter permanently, Miss Holloway, but it will compel Sheriff Ferris to bring Mr. Cooper before a proper hearing, rather than simply delivering him to whoever is waiting in Alameda. And it buys us the days we need to reach the land office hearing with Mr. Cooper standing beside us rather than locked in a cell." He sealed the document, pressed it into Annie's hands, and looked at her with the closest thing to a smile his sober face allowed. "You will need to read this aloud clearly, and you will need to make certain Ferris and anyone with him understands that ignoring a properly sworn writ, once it has been read into the record of witnesses present, is itself a criminal act he will answer for. Courage will get you to that wagon, Miss Holloway. This paper is what will get Mr. Cooper out of it." Annie, Raphael, and 4 Orda's ranch hands who had dropped whatever work they were doing the moment they heard rode hard along the southern road as the afternoon light thinned toward evening, and they caught sight of the prisoner wagon just past a stand of cottonwoods less than a mile from the county line, moving at a pace that told Ferris he sensed no danger behind him yet. "Sheriff Ferris," Annie called out, drawing rein hard enough that Kane's hooves threw up a spray of snow, positioning herself and the writ directly in the wagon's path with the 6 riders fanned out behind her, close enough to be seen clearly but far enough back not to look like an ambush. "I am here on behalf of Judge Percival Ames of the Val Verde, with a properly sworn writ of habeas corpus concerning your prisoner, Warren Cooper." Ferris pulled the wagon up short, one hand dropping toward his sidearm before he seemed to reconsider the number of riders in front of him, and the fact that one of the deputies beside him, a younger man named Tolliver, had gone visibly pale at the mention of a judge's writ. "I have no obligation to answer to some retired judge's paper on a territorial road, ma'am," Ferris said, though there was less certainty in his voice than his words claimed. "You have every obligation, Sheriff, and I intend to read this writ aloud so that everyone present, including your own deputies, understands exactly what obligation that is," Annie said, and unfolded the document with hands that did not shake despite the cold and the danger, and read it clear and steady into the winter air. The finding that the arrest warrant had been executed beyond proper jurisdiction, that no sworn complainant appeared on record, that 3 witnesses stood ready to swear to Warren Cooper's whereabouts at the hour of the alleged crime, and the plain statement, in Judge Ames's careful legal hand, that any officer continuing to detain the prisoner after this writ had been formally presented and witnessed would himself be liable to arrest and prosecution for unlawful imprisonment. From inside the barred wagon, Warren's voice came, calm and clear despite his bound wrists. "Ferris, you know this charge was invented. You know Granger's man never filed a sworn complaint because there was never any assault to complain of. Whatever they are paying you, it is not worth what this writ says will happen to you if you cross that county line with me still locked in this wagon." Tolliver, the younger deputy, looked between Ferris and the paper in Annie's hand, and the 6 riders sitting their horses in the snow with no weapons drawn but no give in their posture either, and made his own decision. "Sheriff, I did not sign on to go against a judge's writ, sworn and witnessed. I am not doing time for Granger's company, not for wages like this." The moment held, tense and silent except for the shifting of hooves and the wind moving through bare cottonwood branches, and then Ferris, weighing the 6 witnesses, the sworn writ, and his own deputy's wavering loyalty against whatever Granger had promised him, let out a long breath and reached for the keys at his belt. "This is not finished," he said, unlocking the wagon's barred door with hands that were not quite steady. "Granger will have something to say about this. Then let him say it in front of the land commissioner in Alameda, alongside the evidence that his company forged a dead man's signature on a land grant document," Annie said. "I imagine that is a conversation he would rather avoid." Warren climbed down from the wagon, wrists still bound until Raphael cut the rope with his own knife, and for a long moment he simply stood in the snow looking at Annie, who had ridden 2 hours through winter cold with nothing but a piece of paper and sheer determination to reach him before the county line swallowed him whole. "You came," he said, voice rough with something that was not entirely relief. "I told you I would let you show me who you are through what you do next," Annie said. "I did not say I would stand aside and wait quietly while you did it. That was never going to be how this worked between us, Warren Cooper." He laughed, short and disbelieving and full of something warm breaking loose in his chest, and did not trust himself to say anything more just then, only reached for her hand and held it, there in the cold, with Raphael and the ranch hands and even Ferris's own deputy looking on, and did not let go for a long while. The hearing before the federal land commissioner in Alameda convened 4 days later, in a courtroom crowded well past its usual capacity with Valley families who had ridden down together, determined to see the matter settled in the open rather than in whispered rumor. Elias Granger arrived with his own lawyer and a confident bearing that lasted exactly as long as it took Judge Ames, called as an expert witness on territorial land grant law, to lay the forged Estrada quitclaim document beside the burial record from the Mission Church proving Tomás Estrada had died in 1861, 23 years before the date on the forged signature. The commissioner, a serious man named Halloran who had clearly seen enough fraudulent land claims cross his desk in his years to recognize the pattern immediately, asked few questions before ordering the survey route invalidated pending full investigation, and asked considerably more questions once Warren took the stand and described, plainly and without excusing himself, the tactics he had witnessed and participated in as a young man riding for the Rio Seco Land Syndicate, tactics that matched, detail for detail, what Granger's company had attempted in the Val Verde. "It cost me something to admit that in front of this valley," Warren told the commissioner, "and it will likely go on costing me for a good while yet. But I would rather pay that cost honestly now than let another family lose their land the way the Estradas nearly lost theirs, and the way my own family nearly lost theirs, to men who count on decent people being too ashamed or too intimidated to speak up." By the time the hearing adjourned, Elias Granger had been formally charged with fraud and forgery under territorial law. The Rio Grande Land and Development Company's investors in Boston had already begun receiving telegrams that made several of them reconsider their involvement entirely, and the survey for the Continental Southern Railway spur line was ordered rerouted around the Val Verde's confirmed grants rather than through them, a decision that would, in the following spring, send the line instead along the drier ground to the east, where no family's home stood in its path. The valley that had, 3 weeks earlier, whispered suspicion of Warren Cooper in a crowded cantina now welcomed him home with something closer to gratitude. And if a few voices still muttered about a man who had once ridden for men like Granger, far more voices pointed out that it was precisely that hard-won knowledge, and the courage to admit to it publicly, that had saved the very land those muttering voices stood on. The schoolhouse was rebuilt through the last weeks of December, faster this time, with nearly every family in the valley turning out to help raise new walls in place of the burned ones, Raphael directing the timber work, Silas Whitfield hobbling about on his mending leg to oversee the stove installation with the fussy precision of a man who had once clerked land records, and saw no reason a building should be assembled with any less care, and Warren himself back atop the roof beams most days, working alongside men who had, weeks before, looked at him with open suspicion, and now simply handed him nails and asked after his mother's health. It was on the evening the new roof was finally finished, with the whole valley gathered for a modest supper to celebrate, that Warren found Annie standing alone by the well behind the schoolhouse, looking up at a sky finally clear of snow clouds, stars spread thick and cold and brilliant overhead. "You never did answer me properly," he said, coming to stand beside her, "about whether that kiss the night of the fire was the danger talking or something real." Annie was quiet a moment, her breath fogging pale in the cold air. "I have had time to think about it since, more time than I expected to need. And I have watched you ride 2 hours to intercept a false arrest with nothing but your own conscience for a weapon. I have watched you stand up in front of a federal commissioner and admit to the worst thing you ever did, knowing it would cost you standing in this valley, because you thought it might save other families the same harm. I have watched you work on this schoolhouse roof for 3 straight days beside men who, 3 weeks ago, would not meet your eye, and I have never once seen you complain about it or ask anyone to forgive you faster than they were ready to." She turned to look at him fully. "I told you trust had to be rebuilt with what you did, not with words. I think you have done more than enough of the doing, Warren Cooper. I am no longer wondering." "That is not quite an answer to my question," Warren said, though his voice had gone unsteady in a way that gave away exactly how much her words had already answered. No, Annie agreed, and closed the distance between them herself this time. No fire at their backs, no danger pressing them together, only the cold, clear night and the schoolhouse they had built and nearly lost and built again standing solid behind them. It was not the danger talking. It was never only the danger, Warren. I think some part of me knew that the very night I stood in your barn defending a pot of stolen oats, and decided you were a far more reasonable man than you looked with that rifle raised. Their second kiss held none of the smoke or fear of the first, only the slow, deliberate warmth of two people who had each tested the other against fire and false arrest and public shame, and found, every time, someone worth standing beside. They did not marry quickly, in the manner of frontier stories that skip from courtship to wedding within a season, because both of them agreed, in the easy, honest way they had learned to speak with each other since the fire, that they wanted the valley to know them first not merely as a romance, but as two people building something real and lasting in the community they had both chosen, in their own separate ways, to fight for. Annie taught through that first winter and into the spring in the rebuilt schoolhouse, her classroom filled now with more children than she had first dared to hope for, Ordaz cousins and Dunmeyer nieces and nephews, and the children of families who had once hesitated sitting together at the same rough-hewn desks, learning their letters in Spanish and in English both, exactly as she had promised Raphael she would teach them. Warren spent that same season helping rebuild trust in smaller, quieter ways than a courtroom confession, riding out to help neighbors whose barns needed mending or whose cattle needed moving before spring thaw, never asking anything in return, until the whispers that had once followed his name faded entirely into simple respect, the same respect his steady hands and honest work had earned him his whole life before Granger's company had briefly, unjustly, threatened to take it from him. By the time the valley's wildflowers came up thick and early that following May, painting the bottomland Granger's survey had once threatened to cut through with color instead of railroad ties, Warren Cooper and Annie Holloway stood together in front of the little mission church in Rincon, surrounded by nearly the whole of the Val Verde, by Dolores in her best embroidered shawl and Raphael standing solemn and openly proud beside her, by Silas Whitfield walking without even the memory of a limp to give the bride away in place of the father who was not there to do it himself, by Judge Ames and Horace Dunmeyer and Mrs. Dunmeyer, who had once doubted whether an unmarried Anglo woman ought to be trusted with the valley's children, and who now wept openly and without shame through the entire ceremony, and by children from Annie's classroom who had, without any grown-up needing to teach them the lesson at all, simply decided that a wedding between the teacher who had taught them their letters and the vaquero who had taught half of them to sit a horse properly was exactly as it should be. "I, Warren Cooper, take you, Annie Holloway," he said, his voice steady in a way it had not always been steady in the frightening weeks before, "with every part of my past, the good and the shameful both, because you taught me that a man is not only the worst thing he has ever done, but also everything he chooses to do afterward to make it right." "I, Annie Holloway, take you, Warren Cooper," she answered, her eyes bright, "because you showed me, when it mattered most, that honesty rebuilt is stronger than trust that was never tested at all, and because there is no one in this territory or any other I would rather stand beside while I find out exactly what I am capable of." The valley that had once watched a stranger bargain a stubborn merchant down to a fair price, and a vaquero decide, in that single unguarded moment, that he had found the most capable woman he would ever know, gathered now to watch that same capable woman and that same steady man promise each other a lifetime. And if anyone among the gathered crowd still harbored old doubts about railroads or grants or a man's long-buried past, none of it mattered half so much, on that bright May afternoon, as the simple, settled certainty on both their faces that they had found, in each other and in the valley they had both fought to save, exactly the place and exactly the person where they finally, fully belonged.